in fact, from what we're doing. And without that, there is little capacity for learning. Finally, there are three structures significant in the way those 5 practices are used. First is time. The rhythm of change is different than the rhythm of continuity. Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, wrote a book called Time's Arrow, in which he argued that the rhythm of continuity is time as a cycle, but the rhythm of change, he said, is time as an arrow. It's finite, focused, and it's intense. Organizing, community organizing, happens through campaigns. Not campaigns that don't mobilize people, campaigns that mobilize, develop leadership, mobilize people, but with very specific deadlines, outcomes, goals, and purposes. The concentration of effort is what allows us to cross thresholds that create capacity. Because in organizing for change, you don't wait until you have all the resources you need to begin. You begin with the necessity and the urgency of action. And you build the resources in the course of the action that you take. Second, community organizing to make a difference has to achieve scale. It's very nice to talk about one neighborhood or another. But in my experience, it's building across neighborhoods as well as down within neighborhoods that creates the strategic leverage, the vision, and the capacity necessary to actually make change. And finally, the single most important structure and the single most important commitment that has to be made to develop organizing as a successful and powerful mechanism for social change and for community improvement is leadership development. Leadership development means a commitment to training, it means a commitment to coaching, it means a commitment to investing the time, it means an understanding that most of us are capable of far more than we are doing at present. That the limitations that we often impose on ourselves are unnecessary limitations. We started a campaign on immigration reform in the United States beginning at the end of August with 40 young people, 20 from Florida, 20 from Colorado. We did a training session of 40. Each of those 20 went back and organized a training session of 135 in Florida, 135 in Colorado. People from that training then went and began to train others. And it wasn't too many months before 200,000 people were mobilized for Washington, D.C., demanding immigration reform from 17 states across the United States. The way it built was learners becoming teachers, becoming learners, becoming teachers, building a cascade of leadership development reaching deeply down into communities and constituencies who can then mobilize the resources that they need in order to make change. So, I just want to conclude then with 3 questions that a first century sage articulated that I think actually capture what community organizing is all about. Certainly it does for me. Community organizing, and this isn't what the sage said, this is what I'm saying. Community organizing, when you think about what you're called to do, he argued, first, ask yourself, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Now that's not a statement about selfishness. It's a statement about appreciation of one's own values, one's own commitments, one's own resources, one's own gifts as a starting point for any action of change. But second, he asks, if I am for myself alone, what am I? Not who, but what. That to be a human being is to recognize that we are in relationship with others, and that the development of the well-being of others is critical to the development of our own well-being. And finally, he asks, if not now, when? The time to act is always now. Because it's often when it comes to shaping the future, it is only by getting into action that we can learn what we need to learn to effectively shape the future in the ways that we would wish and in the ways that we would hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, if you'd like to say a few words.
attended your deliberation for the last 4 days. I want to thank Christine and the rest of the staff and the 25 attendees who I'm sure have benefited a lot. I feel from just attending this lecture, I've benefited. And like I was telling you yesterday, once I'm done being a public servant, I cannot pretend to tell you when that will be. I will be one of your disciples and students at the Kennedy School of Government in Harvard. I'm looking forward to that. But on another front, let me just share with the good people in this room what my perceptions on hope are, because you use hope all the time, and it is something that is very, very important. I have no doubt that Obama, with the effort, the good effort of good souls like yourselves, managed to come across as the first African American president because he gave hope, because there was a lot of hope in those who elected him. And I feel that what we do not have in Amman, unfortunately, or not enough of it, is hope. I know that we have a lot of potential. I know that when you talk about community outreach programs, about communication, about leadership skills, I think there is abundance of it individually. Yet collectively, we fail to align ourselves. We tend to work, like I was sharing with you yesterday, islands. We work territorially. And that is why Amman and Jordan has not been as successful as I know it should. I think, in effect, if we want to effect positive change, then we have to learn more of the other skills, and those skills cannot be just taught. I think the heart and the mind have to work together on them. So I have no doubt that over the last 4 or 5 days, a lot of benefits has been bestowed onto those attended. And the thing with, you keep on talking about time and the importance of time. I remember a saying that said that there is nothing more powerful than an idea that whose time has come. And the time for change, and when I say change, I mean positive change has come. I think the time for cynics, the time for hypocrites, the time for liars, the time for those who have negative attitude should be over. I think we always say the silent majority in Amman are silent. I do not think they are a minority. I don't think they are a minority. I'm beginning to feel that as we progress, they are the majority, and I hope that they will not be silent anymore. I think the time, especially for the young, is to speak out, to communicate. I'll share with you on a final note. The other day I was speaking to a very senior ex-Prime Minister in Jordan, and we were talking about communication. And I told him I use Facebook, I use Twitter, I use the email, and he started laughing. He said, "But you're too old for this." And I said, "But these are good tools." I'm not joking, I'm not spending time, I'm not playing, I'm communicating. This is one tool of communication. So without taking too much of your time, thank you again, Marshall, and I hope we meet again long before I come and visit you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Your Excellency. Now we'll open the door for questions. You can ask either in Arabic or English, and our ushers, they have the mics, and they will pick up the questions.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Allow me to, I was reading an article. Good evening.
See you. Thank you.
Allow me to quote you, quoting Saul Alinsky by saying, organizers need to be willing to be schizophrenic. And because he had to polarize and mobilize. I believe you explained briefly about this. Can you please elaborate more on this topic?
Sure. Whoa, this is very it's a little scary. I was scared myself. One of the great teachers of community organizing in the United States, Saul Alinsky, was started as a sociologist, became an organizer in Chicago in the 1940s and 50s. And he had a lot of sort of wise sayings, and some he sort of loved irreverence. I mean, irreverence was kind of his posture. So he said that organizers of social change need to be well-integrated schizoids, as you said, because you have to polarize to mobilize. In other words, in order to mobilize the power, the attention, the kind of crisis that it often requires to get change, often requires polarization. And by polarization, I mean confronting the public, confronting us with the kind of choice required. In the civil rights movement in the United States, the kind of polarization that it required was, for example, students sitting in lunch counters. And lunch counters where they got arrested because they weren't supposed to sit in white lunch counters. It created a place where people had to choose. Are we with change or are we against change? Now, of course, the timing of when to do that is very, very critical. But Alinsky's point is that it often takes that kind of work in order to make the necessity for change clear. On the other hand, once that's clear, then he argues you have to depolarize to settle. In other words, you have to recognize the role of compromise, the role of negotiations, and the role of understanding common interests. In my own experience organizing farm workers in California, we had to organize people across the United States to stop eating table grapes, because that was the crop that was being produced by these large growers, and they wouldn't recognize the workers' rights or raise the wages. We wound up organizing across the country people not to eat grapes. We got supermarkets to stop selling grapes. It took 5 years. And once we had that, then the growers were ready to negotiate with us. Then we had to shift, and we had to be ready to compromise and negotiate in order to get a deal. So his point is that you have to sort of live in the tension between the two, and recognize when one is appropriate, recognize when the other may be appropriate. I think our president may be struggling with this just a little bit in the United States right now, but I think he's learning. He's a learner. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Mr. Ganz, for the very insightful speech that you've delivered. Well, I happen to know much of the great theory and practice that you've developed just by virtue of translating lots of the notes on organizing. But what I have in mind is that I'm not really ashamed to say that we as Jordanian people, it's deep-rooted in many minds of the society members that certain kinds of change is out of the question. I mean, it's never, ever, forever possible for certain kind of change to occur. This is deep-rooted in our minds. So how can we change that? I mean, I know that you don't have a magical spell to cure that, but how can we change this in our case? Thank you.
You mean, Muhammad, you mean the attitude of
The deep-rooted attitude that certain type of change can never happen. How can we change that?
It's mainly this sense of cynicism that you're talking about, probably, if I understand this correctly.
My friend Tom Higgins, who was very active in the 1960s, once said, change is slow except when it's fast. And there's a lot of truth in what he's saying. And I want to go back to the example of President Obama, not to promote President Obama, but because his election was such an extraordinary event in our history, in the history of my country. It was unthinkable that